If you make good money, maybe even six figures, and yet you still feel like you're barely keeping your head above water, this video is going to hit uncomfortably close to home. Because what if I told you that feeling isn't personal failure, laziness, or bad money habits, but the result of a system that quietly redefined poverty without ever telling you it did? Most people believe poverty starts somewhere around $30,000 a year. That number feels safe. It feels like a clear line between struggling and doing okay. But here's the problem. That number is based on assumptions that no longer describe the world you're living in, and once you see how outdated those assumptions are, you'll realize why so many people feel broke even while technically earning more than ever before. The idea of a poverty line was never meant to be political or emotional. It was originally a practical attempt to answer a simple question: what is the minimum income required for a household to survive? Back in the early 1960s, the government tasked an economist with answering that question, and the logic she used made complete sense for that era. At the time, food was the largest and most predictable household expense. Housing was relatively cheap. Healthcare costs were limited. Childcare was mostly unnecessary because one parent usually stayed home. So the formula assumed that if you knew the minimum cost of feeding a family, you could multiply that number to estimate everything else. And because food made up about 1/3 of a household's budget, they multiplied food costs by 3. That became the poverty line. For that world, it worked. The problem is that the world moved on, but the formula didn't. Over the last several decades, food has become one of the smallest portions of household spending, while everything else has exploded in cost. Housing alone now consumes 1/3 or more of income for many families. Healthcare costs have risen dramatically. Insurance is mandatory. Transportation is essential. Childcare has transformed into the equivalent of a second rent payment. Debt, taxes, and fees that barely existed in the original formula are now unavoidable. And yet, instead of rebuilding the poverty line from scratch, the system simply adjusted the original number for inflation and pretended it still reflected reality. This is where the illusion begins. On paper, poverty appears relatively stable. On paper, things look manageable. But in real life, households are being squeezed from every direction. And when people struggle, they assume something must be wrong with them. They think they're spending too much, not budgeting well enough, not working hard enough. But the truth is, the measuring stick itself is broken. If you take the exact same logic used in the 1960s and apply it honestly to today's spending reality, the result isn't a slightly higher poverty line, it's a dramatically higher one. This is the part that sounds shocking at first, but stay with me. The original formula depended on ratios. Food used to be 1/3 of spending, so the multiplier was 3. Today, food is closer to 5 or 6% of household spending. That doesn't mean life got cheaper. It means everything else became much more expensive relative to food. And when one category shrinks as a share of the budget, the multiplier has to grow. That's basic math, even if it feels counterintuitive. To make this easier to understand, imagine replacing food with the modern equivalent of what dominated budgets back then. Today, that category is housing. Rent or mortgage payments routinely consume around 1/3 of household income. So if you apply the same multiplier logic, the math becomes unavoidable. A household paying $24,000 a year in rent would need more than $70,000 in income just to clear the same survival threshold that the original formula was designed to measure. And that's before healthcare, before childcare, before transportation, before taxes. That's just shelter. When you start stacking the other unavoidable costs of modern life on top of housing, the number rises rapidly. Two-income households triggered childcare expenses that didn't exist in the original model. Health insurance premiums, deductibles, and out-of-pocket costs eat a significant portion of income. Transportation is required to work. Taxes take their share. When you add conservative national averages for these categories, not luxury assumptions, not big coastal cities. The total income required just to cover the basics climbs into territory most people never expected to hear described as poverty. That's where the number around $140,000 comes from, not as a statement about luxury or comfort, but as a reflection of pressure. It represents the income level at which a family can pay for housing, healthcare, childcare, food, transportation, and taxes without constantly falling behind. No vacations, no indulgences, no lifestyle upgrades, just survival with breathing room. And when you realize that the median household income is far below that level, the disconnect between economic statistics and lived experience suddenly makes sense. This is also why so many people feel like progress never arrives. Raises get swallowed by rent increases. Promotions disappear into insurance premiums. The second income in a household often doesn't create upward mobility. It simply pays for the cost of having both parents work. People aren't failing to get ahead. They're running on a treadmill that keeps speeding up. Now, an obvious question comes up here. If the formula is so clearly outdated, why hasn't it been fixed? The answer isn't mathematical. It's political. Updating the poverty line to reflect modern reality would instantly redefine millions of people as poor. That would require more assistance, more spending, and a public admission that the economy isn't working the way it's advertised. So instead, the metric remains frozen and reality is ignored. This creates a strange psychological effect. On one hand, official numbers say things are improving. Inflation is slowing. Unemployment is low. GDP is growing. On the other hand, people feel more stressed than ever. Rent is still high. Groceries still cost more. Healthcare is still expensive. Childcare is still crushing. Slowing inflation doesn't reverse past price increases. It only means prices are rising less quickly than before. And full employment doesn't help if the jobs people have don't cover the cost of living. This gap between macroeconomic success and microeconomics pain is where frustration turns into confusion. People start questioning themselves. They wonder why working harder doesn't produce security. They feel like they're doing something wrong. But the truth is, the indicators being used to measure success don't reflect everyday life anymore. Now, here's the most important part of this entire conversation, because this is where a lot of people misunderstand the message. Saying that modern survival requires far more income than before does not mean your future is hopeless. It does not mean you must earn $140,000 a year to live a good life. The real point is that income alone is no longer a reliable measure of financial health. Wealth is built through time, ownership, and compounding, not just through paychecks. A household earning $50,000 or $60,000 that invests consistently for decades can end up far wealthier than a household earning $150,000 that never builds assets. The poverty line measures survival in the present moment. It cannot measure discipline. It cannot measure patience. It cannot measure long-term investing. This is where personal agency still exists, even in a broken system. You cannot control housing prices. You cannot control healthcare costs. You cannot control outdated government formulas. But you can control savings behavior. You can control investing habits. You can control whether you own assets that compound over time or rely solely on income that gets eaten by expenses. The system may be misrepresenting reality, but it hasn't eliminated opportunity entirely. The people who eventually break free are rarely the ones who earn the most early on. They're the ones who stay invested, avoid lifestyle inflation, and let time do the heavy lifting. Ownership still works. Compounding still works. Patience still works. So if you've ever felt like you're behind despite doing everything right, this isn't a message of despair. It's a message of clarity. The rules changed. The scoreboard didn't. And understanding that difference is the first step toward taking control of what you actually can control. And in the next video, I'm going to break down how people earning average incomes are quietly outperforming high earners in net worth. Not through luck or side hustles, but through a handful of decisions most people never make. If this video helped you see the system more clearly, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who feels stuck, because awareness is where real financial power begins. If this changed how you see money, like the video, subscribe for more deep financial breakdowns, and share it with someone who works hard but still feels stuck.